The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. We're going to get going on the webinar in about another minute, so we'll give folks a few more seconds to go ahead and settle in, and we will begin in 60 seconds. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Human Service Assembly's second webinar in our series on our framing initiative. We will hear in a few seconds from Michael Barron and Nat Kendall-Taylor, from our partners in this project from the Frameworks Institute, on the results of the research report that they've conducted on behalf of the project on mapping the gaps in human services. Just a few housekeeping items before we turn it over to Michael and Nat. If you have questions during the webinar, everyone is on mute. So if you can use the questions function to type in your questions, we'll simply take those in order with as much time as we have left at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Michael and Nat.
Great, thank you very much. So Michael and I are really excited to be talking with you today about the research that we've been doing with the National Human Services Assembly over the last 6 months. This piece of research, which we call Mapping the Gaps, that probably means nothing to most of you, but at the end of this presentation, or actually very shortly as Michael takes over, he will explain exactly what those 3 words mean and why they matter in reframing and thinking about how to communicate more effectively about an issue. So we are very excited to be here and sharing this very fresh out of the field research with you. This is actually the first time that Michael and I have presented this research, short of writing the report. So we will be particularly interested in hearing any comments or questions that you have, and we'll try to restrict our enthusiasm and limit ourselves to about an hour of presentation, which should give us a good half an hour after we've stopped talking for you to ask us questions and for us to do our best to respond to those questions and take any other comments that you have. So we're going to start with a little bit of framing background. I unfortunately have to do the boring background part, and Michael gets to do the part that I normally do, which is the exciting research part. I'll try to move through these 3 reasons why framing matters as fast as I can. I'll try to show you some pictures to make it as interesting and as engaging as possible, but it is important that we start from a common foundational understanding of what it is what we mean when we say framing, such that you all can understand exactly what Michael is talking about when he proceeds to map the gaps after I'm finished. And so I'm going to go through these 3 reasons why framing matters, 3 reasons why anything that Michael is going to say about the results matters, and why you should listen to the remaining 48 minutes of our presentation here. So reason number 1, we say, is that understanding is frame dependent. And I think about this as frames matter because frames matter, because frames, the way that an issue is framed, the way that a message is presented, has dramatic effects on the way that people understand, make sense, and take away information from a particular communication. So I'm going to show you the results of an experiment, and I'll actually go back to these results and tell you a little bit more about how they were gained, how they were procured and analyzed at the end of the presentation. But this is a simple test of the effect of values. You can see 4 values on the lower part of your screen, and the effect that different values have on people's support for, in this case, these were addiction policies. So when I look at this, I notice a couple of things. I notice that there are some values that have reasonably strong effects in increasing people's support for policies, right? Those are effective frames. And I also, kind of the thing that you probably are all noticing right now is what's over on the right-hand side of the screen, is that there are frames also that move people in negative directions. You can frame messages in ways that actually depress people's support for your agenda items, for your issue, for the policies and programs in which you're interested in having them think about. And in this case, that value that depressed people's support on a wide range of addiction policies was the value of empathy. And interestingly, this is the value that the field was using prior to this experiment to frame their materials about addiction. So the communications decisions that you make in terms of the frames that you use have real effects, real implications for the ways that people think about and understand your issue. The second reason why framing matters is, and I should have said at the beginning that Michael and I are both anthropologists, so we'll be talking quite a bit about culture today. And we believe firmly that culture matters. And the reason that culture matters in framing is that framing and communication is really about understanding. And we, in addition to a number of social scientists who aren't anthropologists, believe that understanding is really about culture, that culture influences the way that people understand information. And Michael will be talking at length today about the specific cultural understandings that people draw on and use to make sense of information when they think about human needs and human services and the field which provides those services. But I want to start with a quick exercise that really makes this point. That communication is about understanding, and understanding is about culture. And it's an exercise we call You Say, They Think. And you may have found yourself in this situation where you stand up in front of a group and you're saying AAA, and when questions come back at you, it becomes obvious, sometimes painfully so, that the understanding that your audience took from your message was something dramatically different from that which you intended. And I'm going to use a couple of examples, a couple of quick examples to show you how this works, what this looks like on the issue of human services and human needs. And Michael will dig into these You Say, They Think in great detail after I'm done. So the first is you may stand up and say something like this. In tough times, people need more support, not less. You may not put an exclamation point after it, but I have here. This is no time to start cutting holes in the social safety net. Reasonable message, makes sense. Kind of the social analysis of this is correct. But when people hear this, this is what they do. In tough economic times, people who get those programs have a better quality of life than the rest of us. Must be nice to have some program pick up the tab. And we'll be talking about why this understanding happens. Another You Say, They Think might be human service programs offer critical support for families struggling to make ends meet and for the most vulnerable in our society, youth, older citizens, and people with disabilities. And when people hear this message, this is the takeaway. Meals on Wheels for elderly Americans or people with disabilities is one thing, but able-bodied adults should stop relying on handouts, take care of their own kids, and get a job. The other understanding which might result is, aren't a lot of those programs run by the government? We all know what happens to government programs. People just skim off the top and nothing really changes, right? So you can see that there's something dramatic happening here as that message on the left moves to your audience and is interpreted by them. A final example, we are failing to do right by children and youth. Child poverty, youth homelessness, juvenile delinquency, and other complex challenges threaten the health and well-being of the next generation. Sure, poor kids have to fight to overcome adversity, but this can actually make them tougher and ultimately makes them more successful. I mean, think of all the stories about people who came from nothing and made it big. So this is the central framing problem. And we would argue that the thing that explains the difference between what you see on the left and what you see on the right is, in fact, culture. And there are a lot of people that study this You Say, They Think situation. Our favorite person to quote, because it's a very succinct quote and really captures the breadth of social science that studies this idea, is Deborah Tannen, who is a cognitive linguist at Georgetown University. And she says, in explaining this You Say, They Think phenomenon, that people approach the world not as naive, blank slate receptacles who take in stimuli in some independent, objective way, but rather as, and this is the most important part, experienced and sophisticated veterans of perception who have stored prior experiences and use these prior experiences to make sense of the information that they're being presented with. And now this, when we use this aspect, this key kernel of understanding from the social sciences, we get a very interesting way of looking at the practice of communications and framing. So this way of thinking tells us that communications is not about dropping things into an empty vessel of the public mind, right? Our job is not to create the prettiest messages that we then are able to drop into people's minds and have them make sense of from the bottom up. Instead, people's minds, public thinking, is more like this. It is a swamp of understandings that people have ready and share in common and apply to understand your information, your messages, as they are presented. And Michael will be taking you through, this is what we'll be talking about for the most part today, is that Michael will take you through what this swamp looks like on the issue of human needs and human services. So reason number 3, and I think that this is really, really important on this particular issue, but really bears on most of the issues on which frameworks work, is that sticky frames, right, good stories, well-framed information, not only have an effect on the audience, but they have an effect on the people who are communicating. They have an effect on the field that is framing. So here's what I mean. Take, for instance, human services, which obviously consists of more kind of subdomains as these, but you know, there's people who work on youth, there's people who work on elderly issues, families, disability issues. And what we argue, and what we found throughout our work over the last 15 years, is that an effectively framed story, so what frequently happens is that these subdomains compete, right? It's what we call message competition, that the youth field is messaging in a way that counteracts the messages that's happening from the family domain, and the public is just inundated with communication, struggles to make sense of them, and actually comes away with a less coherent understanding as a result of this competition. Now, frames can fix this problem. An effectively framed set of messages can have the effect of bringing fields together and uniting them under a common umbrella of a framing strategy of a set of messages, right? So this is a positive effect in and of itself. But there's the added bonus, there's the gravy of having all of these people saying the same thing, using the same messages, can amplify the effect of those messages. And this is really how, when you have one story coming from a field, this is really how public understanding of social issues and policy has the power to change. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Michael. The boring stuff is over. The exciting stuff is about to begin. And Michael is going to tell you what these 3 words on the screen that you see in front of you actually mean, and how they help us understand the communications challenges that are ahead of us in reframing human services.
Thank you very much, Nat. Although I do not think that was boring at all, I do agree that this is going to be exciting. So hold on to your hats. Because I get the job of actually giving you the content, what we actually found, what it is that actually gets in the way there between, you know, when you think about those slides, what's getting in the way of the you say and they think. So I'm going to take you through this first stage of the research process, stage we call mapping the gaps, that really represents the descriptive work that we do on a project before we get into the prescriptive reframe research. So when I say mapping the gaps, this is what I mean. We first interview experts in the field, and these are scholars, scientists, policy folks, advocates. We analyze these interviews to find common themes and isolate what we call the untranslated story of human services, the base for what's later going to be the reframed story. Then we interview members of the general public, and these are 2-hour in-depth interviews where we use methods from cognitive science to uncover not only how people explicitly say they think about a topic, but also the very deep, implicit cultural assumptions that they bring to mind when they think, you know, on a really basic level, what this issue is about, what kinds of organizations populate this space, how do they even work, and so on. We call these implicit, shared, patterned ways of thinking cultural models. and I'm going to use that phrase a lot. That's our basic unit of analysis here for understanding public thought in a given culture. So at this point, we take those two sets of interviews after we analyze them, we hold them up to each other, and we find points of overlap, because not everything is bad here. In some cases, the public is thinking a lot like the experts, and that's great. That actually forms the basis for potentially productive places to message later on. Then we isolate the gaps in the thinking, the big differences in the fundamental ways that experts and members of the public are thinking about these issues. And these are areas that we then target for potential reframes later in our research, so that members of the public can access ways of thinking that are more in line with the experts. And then when that happens, they can be more receptive to messages and more likely to support productive policies on these issues. So this is what we're going to go through for the next half hour, 40 minutes. I'll characterize each of these spheres of understanding. I'll compare them. I'll point out the places where they match up and where they don't match up. And as I'm going through this, I'll point out some of the implications for communication, so we can see a framing strategy starting to emerge from this work, even though this is just, the descriptive work so far. So we'll get started with looking first at the expert understanding. All right, now there's a lot of stuff on this screen. I am not going to go, and read it all. But these are the messages that have been pulled out as common themes among the experts that we interviewed. And like I said, they form what we call the untranslated story of human services. Obviously untranslated, because we're going to try to reframe this and translate it at some point down the line. So for clarity's sake here, I separated these out into 4 different areas, 4 different questions that these points respond to. What are human services? Why are they important? What are the challenges they face? And what can be done to improve human services? And like I said, I'm not going to go through and read all these, but I'll highlight a couple of points that are going to be really important later as we talk about gaps and overlaps. So first on this definitional slide, we see that experts are talking about human services as providing both basic and higher order needs. And they do this work through direct services, of course, but also through advocacy to address the social determinants that are really important, like poverty and inequality, these deeply rooted issues that are really based in structures and institutions of society. Now, if you look at why human services are important, and of course, as I'm going through this, a lot of this is going to sound really familiar to you because this is largely probably the story that many of you are working with. So if you look at why human services are important, you see that experts are stressing that these organizations affect more than just their target population, that they have impacts that are important for all of society. And they're important because some people face disproportionately more stressors than others, and they need that extra support. If you look at the top right there, what are the challenges that the field faces? You'll see that experts are talking about the way the field is divided into silos, the way that there's not enough funding, and that certain things especially are underfunded, like the advocacy and prevention work. And experts are talking about being constrained in the work they do by public understanding that isn't quite where they are, and by reliance on the way that the donor structure works. And of course, I'm considering all this. Experts talk a lot about improving human services by focusing more on root causes, focusing on prevention, focusing on communities, and a lot of talk about collaboration, sharing knowledge, sharing service design, and collaborating to communicate with the public. So sounds very much like an expert story, right? Now, if we move from the expert story to what the public thinks about this issue, we are going to get into that swamp. Everybody get ready. Get your waders on. So this slide here represents what the swamp looks like for human services. And what I want you to get out of this is that it's kind of a mess in here, like a swamp is. And so when you engage people in thinking and reasoning about issues related to human services, you really are getting a swirling swamp of understandings and assumptions that is hard to figure out. And like I said before, some of these are somewhat productive with respect to that expert story that I just talked about. You know, good plants and orchids and things like that. But other things in the swamp are highly unproductive, nasty alligators that will eat your message in a second. And we'll talk about those too. So one of the key takeaways for today is that if you know what's in this swamp and what triggers various models and what effect that can have on how people understand your communication, you can actually increase your effectiveness as a communicator immensely by knowing what to tap into and what to avoid. And so when you really understand this graphic, it can be a serious tool for you. I'm going to, like I said, it's kind of a mess, so I'm going to walk you through this a little bit more systematically to show you what's in there. Thus begins our tour through the swamp. So the first thing I want to point out here before I start is that the public doesn't really have a solid understanding of what human services are. And so I'll be talking about that more later. But that makes a tricky interview. So what we do when we encounter a situation like that is we often start by going to kind of a deeper level in public thought. And in this case, since experts talk about human services being designed to help people achieve and maintain well-being, we ask, how does the public even think about what well-being is? Okay? And when we do that, we find three key cultural models that get invoked when people think about well-being in this space. The first and most critical, I would say, is this one that we call self-sufficiency or financial self-sufficiency. That in order to be doing well, you've got to be financially self-sufficient. And this applies to the way people think of everyone, young adults, the elderly, families, people with disabilities. And as self-sufficiency declines and people start to think about people not doing so well, they kind of invoke the opposite of self-sufficiency, which in this case is dependency, which is considered really bad because it violates this fundamental cultural assumption about what doing well is. So if you get assistance, especially sustained assistance, you are fundamentally not doing well. Okay, that's really important. Now, obviously, this model is very individualistic. That being said, the public does have some sense that social connections are important for well-being. Okay? There's a cultural model in here that we call sociality is key. And that's because people do talk about how everyone needs social connection. And this comes into play especially when they're thinking about kids developing well, when they're thinking about whether the elderly are doing well or not. And this would, on the surface, seem to be against that individualism focus of the self-sufficiency model. But it's not really. The sociality is considered important mainly because it gives an individual self-confidence. It gives an individual peace of mind. It sets an individual up for success. So the beneficiaries of this sociality are just individuals and not the collective, right? So the social connections are enhancing employability, for example, but not so much community, right? And then finally, of course, when the public thinks about well-being, they think largely of health. That might not be surprising, but they do so in really specific ways. So they're thinking predominantly in terms of physical health. And they're thinking about physical health often in terms of the models that we just talked about. Health as something that could get in the way of financial success, something that could get in the way of self-sufficiency. That's important to note. Also, it's important to note what they're not talking about, right? They are not thinking about health in terms of mental health. Even in the rare cases where they do talk about something like mental health, it's kind of through a physical health lens. So like they'll talk about the physical decline of older Americans, which includes their minds physically deteriorating. So it's kind of mental health, but also pretty squarely in the realm of physical health. So those are the cultural models you find when you look at definitionally at what people are thinking about well-being. And these have some pretty profound communications implications, which are coming.
Bear with us 1 second. We have a beeping computer here.
There we go. There we go. Oh. I'm going to run. All right.
Start going through them.
So communications implications here. One of the major ones here is that some kinds of support are acceptable and some kinds of support are not acceptable, considering these cultural models that people bring to mind when they think about this issue. So something like job training that puts people on a path from dependency towards self-sufficiency actually gets a lot of support. Something like food stamps, on the other hand, which implies some sort of never-ending lack of self-sufficiency, is not generally as well accepted. And just to point out, this is true across the political spectrum. This is not about conservative folks not supporting that policy. This is true across the political spectrum. Second, it's pretty obvious from these models that individualism dominates. This is important because even when people are invoking sociality, the individualism underlying it still makes it really hard to think about systems, causes, or collective benefits to policies. And finally, as I mentioned, it's really important to keep in mind how mental health is largely invisible. Even when you mention mental health, it's really likely that that message gets eaten in the swamp, so that people are thinking about physical health even though you're talking about mental health. So you have to frame messages very carefully to highlight that unseen aspect of health. All right, so now we have a sense of how well-being is being defined. And of course, central to this idea of human services is that some people are doing well and other people are not doing so well. And so we have some sense already of why experts think that's happening. Why does the public think that's happening? Okay, what is the causal reason behind some people doing well and others not doing so well? The first of these harkens back to that individualism that we saw in the previous section. We call this idea of frameworks mentalism. We find it in a lot of different projects. It's basically the idea that people do well because of their own individual motivation and their individual willpower. All people have the opportunity to do well, and those who do are the ones who choose to, and those who don't, well, it's pretty much their own fault. This comes up a lot when people think about the poor or those needing some sort of assistance. Individual shortcomings are to blame for people not doing well, not systemic factors. And this model kind of allows people to think they can judge whether or not people deserve human services, since there's that element of choice. Now, when people are thinking about children specifically, why some children do well and others don't, they drew on another very common cultural model that we often find that we call the family bubble. And by that thinking, parents, and only parents, are the reason why children turn out well. And that's the way it should be. It's their responsibility. Now, calling it a bubble here is not accidental, because another part of this thinking is that the community at large is a potential bad influence. It's a source of danger, and that children should be protected from it rather than seeing it as an opportunity for additional supports and for children to do well. Now, in this project in particular, we found an associated idea that we call the community's nostalgia model, which is really people lamenting some romanticized version of a community that occurred in the past, where the village raised a child, and where people knew their neighbors, and everyone helped one another out. But because modern society is not like that, basically everyone today is not doing as well as they used to. Now there's some really important implications here too. The implications here for communications and human services, looking at this first point here, are that the really intense individualism of the mentalism model make it very hard for the public to think about causality in terms of structures and institutions, and to appreciate the work that human services could do, that the work that they do and could do more of when you think about prevention and addressing root causes. And kind of like that mentalism model, it applies to the family bubble too, since the public understands parents as separate from and not constrained by systems and institutions in society. Now when you think about the community nostalgia model, you might think this could be a good place to message, right? People are longing for strong, supportive communities. That doesn't sound bad at all. And in fact, later on in my presentation, I'm going to talk about that kind of as an overlap between the public and experts. But what you do find in these interviews is also a strong sense of inevitability and fatalism about this. It's just the way it is in the modern world. Cell phones and schedules and cities, and when you get people thinking in this fatalistic way that that's just a march of progress, it really leads to a disengagement about the issue. So it's important to take the positive aspects and build on them without cueing that larger sense of fatalism. Talking about how a program, for example, could strengthen a community without invoking nostalgia for some past time. Now on to human services specifically, and what are they? We found that pretty much, and I mentioned this before, pretty much universally, people were unaware of that term. And we asked them to guess what they thought it might mean. They were pretty hesitant. We got a lot of stuttering, a lot of stammering, a lot of services for humans. Eventually, we got people talking about a limited set of organizations, and these are national, big brand type organizations: Big Brother, Big Sister, Salvation Army, Red Cross. And when we asked who they were designed to help, who the target population was, they talked about the poor. Okay, that's what happens when we asked what human services were. We then broke it down and we asked them about specific populations. And when we did that, we got a slightly wider range of services emerging. So we asked if there were services for children. And people talked a little bit about education and after-school programs and mentorship programs. We asked them if there were services for families. And then people talked a little bit about counseling, financial support services. We asked them about the elderly, and they talked about Meals on Wheels and health care. And we asked them about people with disabilities, and they talked about transportation services and job support. So that's basically what people are thinking about when they're hearing about human services. Now let's look at how they think human services work, because this is also really important. All right, when we dug down deeper to understand how people think the human services work, we found 4 operating cultural models. First, and this probably is not surprising to you, that people are thinking about human services as direct services. No one is talking about or thinking about advocacy work, prevention work in the realm of what a human service would do, even when we kind of push them in that direction to try to get them to think about it. People are considering human services to be about individual acts of kindness and charity. So a lot of talk about churches and soup kitchens and the moral virtues of volunteering. And this was applied to both individuals who donate their time and money and to organizations who do that work. Only the basics. So people are dividing the world up into wants and needs, right? And human services should only be concerned with the needs, the basics. If you have an iPhone, if you have a nice car, that person is not considered to be deserving of any human service, because they have already moved beyond the realm of needs into wants. And then, in a similar vein, this idea of austerity, that those people receiving human services and those people working in the human services are supposed to be living an austere lifestyle. Anything else is evidence of corruption, greed, or abuse of the system. So that's the really bad news for you guys. I hope you're all driving Ford Fiestas and using flip phones and eating generic brand Oreos, because that's what you are expected to do if you work in this field. All right, now obviously there are some really important communications implications here in terms of what people are thinking human services are and how they work, right? So as long as people are thinking really narrowly about human services organizations as direct service organizations, all kinds of things are not going to get seen, like attempts to professionalize staff, dedicate funds for research and development, to lobby for structural change. These are all going to be seen as inappropriate because these efforts reduce the amount of money that can be given directly to those in need. So expanding this conception of human services is going to be really important to give people a concrete sense of the breadth of human service work and the preventative work that can be done is going to be really important. Also, the way people think about how human services work is going to be really important for thinking about that idea of more funding. So there's a really powerful logic going on here that's kind of structured by the models I talked about earlier. So you got human services conceptualized really narrowly as direct services, and money is being given to people in need, but it's kind of thought to have a corrupting influence on their mentalism, their motivation to become self-sufficient, which leads to this cycle of dependency. So according to this logic, the more money that's given to people, the more dependent they become, and, ironically, basically the more stuck they are in poverty, right? So this is a really important cultural script, and communication research here is going to have to figure out a way to interrupt this pattern of thinking and replace it with something more productive for thinking about human services and support and funding. So now that we've gone through definitional models, causal models, and thinking about how human services work, we've got to look at how people think it's going to get better, and specifically who has the responsibility for making sure things get better. So one of the principles we know from cognitive science is that there's going to be a connection between the way that people think about the cause of something and their understanding of who is responsible for making that situation better and how to do it. And this also affects the way they support certain initiatives and certain policies. Not a huge surprise that it works this way, but let's look at the specifics. So when that mentalism model gets causally invoked, right, you could probably guess what's going to come on the other side of this column here. People are thinking about individuals as being responsible for themselves. I think Nat mentioned this before, but lazy people need to get off their butts, stop collecting food stamps, and get a job. When the lost community model gets invoked, people see a distributed model of responsibility where different organizations fill in what used to be filled in by the community. So, churches, schools, families, charities. And you might be thinking that sounds pretty good. But again, hold on to that thought. Now, there's this recessive model that comes up. And by recessive, I mean it's not present for most informants, or that it really only rears its head in very rare circumstances. But there is occasionally public thinking about structural inequality, that not everyone gets the same individual opportunities, and that something should be done about that. And in that case, people often think and look to the government, okay? But what quickly happens is that there's this really dominant model of government as inept and corrupt that takes over and basically negates any potentially productive associations. All right, so let's think about the implications of this here. First, the mentalism leads to individual responsibility. I'm basically repeating that because the importance cannot be overstated. These notions of individual responsibility work against and most likely depress support for the work of human services and the collective responsibility for social problems. So that's really important. Talked about community, the lost community, right? And I mentioned how this idea of distributed responsibility is kind of filling in for that lost community. And it doesn't seem like such a bad thing, and that's true. You know, it's not terrible. But the problem is that that solution, kind of like the romantic idea of the lost community itself, is assumed to be this informal thing that happens spontaneously, that happens organically. And so these more intentional, structured supports for human services don't necessarily fit into that model and don't necessarily get the support that they should. And then finally, of course, it's great when people are reasoning using this recessive model of unequal opportunity. And it's great when they start thinking about government as a collective place where structural inequalities can be mitigated. But this ideal way of thinking of government for the people quickly turns into a cynical understanding of the way it really is, which is inept and corrupt. And we find this across many different issues. We have recommendations on how to try to avoid that kind of thinking. For example, like talking about the everyday work of local governments rather than focusing on national politics, for example. All right. So when we take those models that are in the swamp there and hold them up against that expert story, like I said, there are actually quite a few overlaps that come into relief. And that's good news. Often when we do this, we get a list of maybe 3 or 4 things in this list. This seems like a pretty good set of overlaps. That being said, each of these, none of these is perfect. Each of them has a certain, yeah, there's an overlap, but there's also kind of a gap related to them. Okay? So I'm going to go through these one by one. For example, if you look at the first one, both experts and members of the public are talking about people having a common set of needs for well-being. But the specifics of that well-being are very different. You know, for the public, it's about financial self-sufficiency, and for the experts, it's about quality of life. Similarly, experts and the public are talking about the importance of social connections. But the reasons why they're talking about the importance of those social connections and the benefits of those social connections are really different. We talked about how at some level the public overlaps with experts in thinking about government responsibility for supporting citizens. And that's great. But for the public, like I just mentioned, this quickly gets taken over by the government is inept and corrupt model. Experts and the public talked about how services can and should be improved. But how they can be improved is really different. You know, the experts are talking about more funding for research and prevention. And the public is talking about less corruption, right? Both groups see job training and education as ways to help people basically help themselves, to get some agency over their own lives. But for the public, this was, again, all about financial self-sufficiency. And for the experts, it was much more about collective benefits and interdependence, right? And finally, as I was just talking about, both groups see strong communities as an important solution for the future. But for the public, this ideal vision lies in the past, while the current vision of communities is much more really about danger and not support. So the bottom line here is that these are potential areas for communication, but only if done really carefully. Okay. Now if you look at the gaps, I'm going to go through these again. There's a larger set of gaps. But since many of those overlaps that I just talked about also entailed gaps, and I would just be repeating myself by going through this in great detail, I'll go through it pretty quickly here. So we talked about basic difference in how well-being is thought of as financial autonomy for the public and quality of life for the experts. We talked about the different reasons why social connections are important, right? For the experts, this is an end in and of itself, and for the public, this is a means to an end. You can see a really important gap here in terms of the scope of human service work. Again, for the public, this is just direct services, and for the experts, they are thinking, yes, about direct services, but also about advocacy and prevention. Experts are often very critical of this charity model of work as outdated, and they're looking for a new paradigm for the work that they do, a new way to think about the work of human services. But for the public, this charity model is still the way the work is conceptualized, and they are seeing nothing wrong with that. I mentioned that this was a huge gap here on funding, where the experts are seeing more funding is absolutely critical to moving beyond this charity model, to being able to do research and advocacy and prevention work. And this is really one of the biggest gaps, where the public is seeing increased funding as not problematic. More money is problematic because it's going to lead to more handouts, more dependency. Okay. We talked about the differences in causes, right, which similarly lead to differences in solutions and responsibility, where experts are seeing structural causes, which of course demand structural solutions, and the public is seeing individual causes, that mentalism model. You've got to choose to do it, pick yourself up and do it, which lead to individual solutions, right? And individual responsibility for solutions. We talked about the difference in attitudes towards government. For the experts, absolutely necessary, and for the public, problematic because of the associations with corruption. And finally, a big gap about, who benefits from human services. For the experts, everyone benefits from human services. And because of the very narrow way that the public is looking at this, the people that benefit are those direct recipients of those services. So that's a summary of our research to this point. We've outlined the swamp of public thinking. We've held that up to the untranslated expert story. And what we find when we do that, to summarize, is some promising overlaps, but that all have potential to quickly turn into gaps when you dig a little bit deeper. And so as communicators, that should give you pause, but also give you hope. And to give you a little bit more hope, I'll turn it back over to Nat, who will explain where do we go from here.
All right, thank you. This is the part in the presentation, this is the part in the research where most people have their, if I could see you, most of you probably have your heads in your hands and are quite overwhelmed with this imposing graphic of gaps, which basically looks like everything you want to talk about in front of you. But this is the part where we shift from, this is the part in the research where we shift from a situation analysis, that is the ways that experts think, the ways that members of the public think, the differences and similarities between those two, to a focus on prescriptive work. In other words, to a focus on how you actually, to mix a metaphor, bridge those gaps and get through the swamp of public understanding. So we've reached the point in the research where kind of the most sobering part, where we've mapped those gaps. But now we're getting into the more optimistic part of the research, where we begin to develop and test tools that can give you a way of responding, of being strategic in the way that you communicate, such that you are creating space for people to think more productively about your issues, such that you are giving people ways of processing messages that predispose them to think about the importance of human services, of collective benefits, of common good. And so we are perched between items 3 and 4 on this 5 steps to reframing an issue. And I'm going to spend our last 10 minutes here talking to you about not only the lay of the land that this research has shown us, but also what it is indicating to us as reframers in terms of a strategy, or as I will talk about, 2 strategies to move forward with and pursue in future communications research, and in coming up with strategies to get you through the swamp. And this research has really shown us the need for and appropriateness of what we call a 2-pronged reframing approach, and this is what I mean. So the reframing strategy will first need to take advantage of the existing 15 years of communications research that Frameworks has done, as well as communications research that have been done by other communications researchers and social scientists. So we have at Frameworks are always working on multiple, as we say, dire social problems, many of which bear some conceptual similarities to the gaps and the overlaps that Michael has talked about. So that if the issues bear conceptual similarities, the tools designed to address the challenges also are promising to move between issues. So just to give you an idea of the other work that Frameworks is doing just right now, let alone the work that it's done over the past 15 years, we have work on early child development. We have work on criminal justice. We have work on climate change. We have work on aging and generational change. We have work on addiction. We have work on, what else do we have work on, Michael? Environmental health, of education and educational disparities. And the beauty of being in kind of an open source nonprofit communications organization is that we can, and our approach is founded on the idea that we can take learnings and tools from other issues and bring them to bear on new issues that we're doing work on. So I want to show you what I mean here in terms of this first prong of the reframing approach. So when you look at these gaps, it's important to understand that we aren't starting from scratch in bridging them. Instead, we have tools, and I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 of them, that have been shown on other issues to have power in bridging some of these conceptual gaps. So for example, Frameworks has done a number of tests of values, so broad orientational perspectives, and the power of those orientational perspectives in bridging gaps. We've tested the value of interdependence, right, that issues are important and social change is necessary because we are all, at the end of the day, interconnected and interdependent as a society. And I think, looking at these conceptual gaps, that this value, evoking the value of interdependence, is going to be, has potential to be effective in bridging this gap around social connections, right? In allowing people to see that social connections are an end, an important end, and not just a means to individual ends. In addition, we've done work that has looked at kind of this gap, that has looked explicitly on this gap around causes. A lot of this is work we're doing right now on criminal justice, which I think is just fascinating. It's work that's just come up on our website. If people are interested in this kind of structural, individual aspect of culture and how you can begin to bridge these gaps, I would encourage you to visit that part of our website. But we found that values like fairness between places and metaphors that come out of our work on resilience and child development outcomes have been highly effective in giving people more structural views of the things that cause outcome disparities, or disparities in outcomes. And I think that these tools are going to be highly pertinent and have potential to be very effective in bridging kind of what I see as one of the most conspicuous gaps on this set. We also have work that's used metaphors of the prosperity grid, which you can read more about on our website, and the value of pragmatism, which can be very effective in addressing this gap around solutions. And again, combating or inoculating against senses of fatalism and providing a structural view of the things that must be done to address the disparities in outcomes that we observe. So I think this is the first strategy, and this is a kind of a low-hanging fruit strategy, is that we have to mine these tools that exist on other issues, bring them to bear, and test them for their ability to help people think about that untranslated story that Michael talked about at the top of the hour here. The other prong of the approach is equally important, but requires slightly more work, and that is to address the unique challenges that are posed on this issue. So Frameworks has touched on issues, for example, of poverty in a number of the projects that we've worked on, but has yet to do a project on addressing or reframing poverty, right? So that is a unique challenge that is posed in this human services research, which we, quite frankly, don't have tools that we can take out of the existing toolbox and apply to reframing this issue. So that's going to require some new communications research, developing and testing new strategies that can, I think, address these 4 points, which are really, in my mind, and in Michael's mind, because he came up with these as well, the unique challenges that are posed on this issue of human services for which we do not have existing tools ready to apply. So the first thing is in redefining what Michael started with, which is people's conceptions of well-being, and that we think redefining, not only redefining, expanding people's perceptions of well-being is going to be central in giving them a wider view, a preventative view of human services. We think that there is something to work with in people's understandings of community, but that in its current form, it is highly unproductive in both its attachments to ideas of danger, communities are things to be protected from, as well as those senses of fatalism that Michael talked about. So there needs to be work done in trying to kind of harvest some of the productive senses of the importance of community and redirect that understanding, rechannel it in a more productive way. I think there's also work to be done in highlighting, as I kind of just said, this idea of prevention, right? In combating people's dominant understanding, their sole understanding of human services as kind of reactive and direct services, and giving people a way to think about the causes of the problems that human services is addressing in a way that allows people to see that you can actually get in front of and prevent those issues from happening in the first place. And I also think that there's work to be done in highlighting, again, as Michael talked about, at great length, this collective orientation and deactivating or pushing to the back what is the most foregrounded way in the swamp of people to think about, that people have to think about these issues, which is individualism. So trying to kind of orchestrate, which we call kind of a foreground to background shift, taking the collective orientation, which is a part of the swamp, but which is really deep and unpracticed, and bringing it to the forefront and having that be the dominant orientation that people use as they're thinking about the issue. So I want to tell you very, very briefly about 2 tools that we rely on at Frameworks to do some of that work that you saw on the last slide. And the first is values. And values, as you can see on the screen, are these enduring beliefs. To use a metaphor, I think about them as kind of perceptual lenses. They are things that people can adopt and put in front of their view, which kind of focus their perspective on a given issue. They are the things that help people answer the questions of what is at stake and why does the issue matter. And you see in front of you 3 values, just to give you an example of what we mean when we say a value, of values that we occasionally test and experiment with. The tricky thing about values is that there are a lot of them, that different values have different effects. Some values have a positive effect in relation to our goals of expanding perspectives. Other values, as you saw on the first slide that I presented, actually depress and close down people's perspectives in terms of thinking about new information. So what we do at Frameworks is we experiment with values. And this is what I mean. I'm going to show you where those bars came from that I showed you at the top of the hour here. So we do online experiments where we recruit large samples of Americans. We randomly assign them to a value. So some of those 2,500 people get prevention, others get interdependence, others get ingenuity, others get empathy, and finally the lucky few get no value, which is a control condition. We then ask and this is what a value looks like. So this is from an experiment that we've done in Alberta on addiction. So what you're seeing now is this value of empathy, what it looks like, what people read when they're exposed to this value in the online experiment. We then ask everybody, regardless of which value they got, to answer a set of outcome questions. And in this case, we were interested in how these values affected people's support for specific policy, evidence-based policy, science-based policy around addiction. And here are kind of, just to give you an idea of some of the policies that we asked people about. These are specifically policies that deal with addiction treatment. So the province, number 3, should develop a system-wide case management system. Number 4, Alberta needs to develop information sharing systems, and you can see, right, so on and so on. And then we do an analysis at the end that compares, that looks at the effect that exposure to one value had versus another on people's support, on the level of support that people indicated for the policy outcomes. And this is where we get the graph that I showed you on the first slide. So we see that some values are effective, right? But different values do different things. So you see the value of prevention is particularly good at addressing kind of the issues of comorbidity, that addiction is rarely ever an issue in and of itself on its own, but it has implications for mental health and other services. And you see that there is a value, and as I said before, this is the value that the field in Alberta was using, that is pretty universally unproductive in increasing people's support for the kind of policies that the field wants to move. And this is why we experiment with values, and we think that values are going to be centrally important in doing some of the work that I showed you on the previous slide, particularly in shifting people from these highly individualistic notions of the problem to more collective orientations for thinking about human services and human needs. The other tool that we frequently bring to bear, and I think this will be, again, of central importance in addressing the gaps that Michael took you through, is what we call an explanatory metaphor. So an analogy, a simple analogy that makes something that is hard to understand easier to understand by comparing it to something that we all have kind of everyday, familiar, concrete experience with. And here's an example. So when you think about infant-caregiver interaction, when you look at these pictures, most people think one thing, kind of that's cute, you know, that baby is babbling. But what they don't look at is the key feature of development that developmental scientists talk about when they think about this interaction, right? And so we found that through a very simple comparison to this idea of serve and return, you get people immediately to focus their attention on the feature of that interaction, the back and forth, reciprocal, upheld nature of the interaction that is driving development, right? And so these tools focus people's attention and get them to understand a particularly difficult to understand thing about a complex situation through a very simple analogy. Now, when people get wind of metaphors, they frequently get what I call metaphor lust. They start thinking about all of the great ideas that they have in their head about ways that we can make up metaphors for human services. We caution against that from a lot of hard and painful experience. And we have developed over the last 5 years an empirical, rigorous way of developing and testing metaphors that starts with a group of social scientists on our staff who design metaphors that they think achieve certain specific conceptual tasks. We test them in on-the-street interviews. We do large-scale experimental surveys. We do kind of a glorified research game of telephone where we pass a metaphor around and see what happens as it is passed. We finally, in usability tests, put the metaphor in the hands of experts and see how they are, and frequently are not able to use it and can make adjustments to the metaphor in that way. And at the end of this process, we arrive at an empirically sound metaphor. And what I mean by empirically sound is that it has a similar effect across multiple people, and that effect is positive in relation to the goals that we have in our communications. And the last step in our process, so step number 5 in the 5 steps to reframing an issue, is actually what you do when we have all of this knowledge, all of this understanding of the swamp and of the gaps and of the overlaps and what tools you can use to bridge them and get through the swamp. That doesn't do a bit of good if it sits on Michael and I's desk. And the final step in any communications or reframing effort is to figure out ways strategically to take that research and those results and put them in the hands of the people who can kind of orchestrate the dissemination of the frame such that they can have the effect that our research has documented on members of the public. And with that, I think we're 2 minutes over where I wanted to be, but very, very close. I'm going to bring this to an end. I'm going to ask our colleagues at NHSA to read off some of the questions. I have no idea if people have been having questions, but I'm guessing they do. People normally do. So I'm going to turn this over to our colleagues at NHSA who are going to read some of the questions, and Michael and I are going to do our absolute best to provide you with answers to all of your deep and burning questions.
Hi, Matt and Michael, and thanks again for the presentation. And we've got a number of questions coming in. So, folks, if you could just type in your questions into the questions function, we will just read them off and take them in order that you send them in. So the first question we have is, could Nat and Michael say more about the fairness between places, concepts, and the outcome scale, and specifically about how using those metaphors bridges the gaps that you were talking about in the presentation?
Yeah, so I'll take that one, and Michael will feel free to add on to my and further develop my answer where he has them. So fairness, I think fairness. We could do a whole series of hours on the value of fairness, which is, as people can readily identify, a Central American value. The issue or the tricky thing about fairness is there's more than one flavor of it. Right? And I've read an article, I can never remember what article it was, but it talks about at least 9 flavors of fairness in American culture. And so the issue with fairness is that you have to be very careful in how you deploy it as a value and how you use it to orient people towards an issue. And we've found through a lot of work, particularly our work on race, that when you lead with a value of fairness between groups, you actually make people less supportive of progressive policies. So people start thinking about us versus them. They start thinking about what I have, what I want, and what I want to keep, and what I don't want to have go over there to, quote unquote, those people. And it creates an unproductive dynamic for people to think about resource-based discussions of social policy. On the other hand, we've found that when you activate an understanding of fairness between places, which is basically a systemic version of the populational argument, right? So it's the idea that there are different areas in this country, and that depending upon where, it's kind of the zip code argument, that depending upon where you live, your access to the things that people need to be successful is dramatically different from the access of someone who lives, across town, in a different part of the state, in a different part of the country. So that, we have found, is a much more productive way of evoking what is a powerful value and getting people to actually think in a productive way about the need to address the policies that shape those inequities between places. So that's my answer to the fairness between places. The outcome scale, I would encourage the person who has this question to go on our website and look in the early child development part of it. There is a whole paper on this metaphor, but essentially this is a metaphor that comes out of our work on early child development and resilience. And without taking too much time, people have a very dominant understanding of resilience, that it's this individual trait that you kind of, basically they have a model which is of resilience which is synonymous with willpower. And the outcome scale is a way of getting people to see the fact that children particularly, but really anyone, sits in a community, and that community puts things onto their scale that determines the way that scale tips, i.e. the outcomes of development. So it has been a powerful way of getting people to really contextualize processes that they, again, have a strong tendency to individualize and view in terms of willpower. That's a short answer to a question that probably deserves a long answer, but if the person who asked that question is interested, please look at our website and get in touch with us if you've got further questions about those tools.
All right, next question. Could you define mentalism in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, sure. So mentalism is this idea, and the title might be a little bit wonky. I've wondered about that title before, but it's basically, it's similar to what Nat was just talking about that we find in resilience. The idea of mentalism is that for something to change, it's only dependent on an individual and their willpower, then that's why it's called mentalism, right? So if they want to change, they will change, and it's not based in structural inequalities, in systemic issues, that this is just an individual and their own choices and desires and willpower and basically inherent mental qualities.
Right. Extremely, extremely helpful. Next question, is there any way to come up with explanatory metaphors that we non-communication experts could try so we can test our own ideas? And I think that's something that you were addressing right at the end.
Yeah, so I think there is a role in that process that I talked about for what what the person who's asking that question is saying. And I wish I could point to a part of the screen here, but I'll try to describe it to you. So I would say the hardest part of the metaphor process, and Michael and I are about to get into this process on two different issues, is what you see in the upper left-hand corner, which is where we design, where we come up with candidate metaphors that we think stand a reasonable chance of addressing one or more of those gaps, right? So, you know, what are the metaphorical ideas we could use to get people to expand their definition of well-being? What is a metaphor that really that gets people to understand well-being in a more holistic, less financial and individualistic way? That's a really hard thing to do. And I don't think that we could have too much information come into that part of the process. And you know, if there is interest in crowdsourcing some of this generation, I would. And Michael's laughing and nodding his head in a knowing way. I think if people have ideas about this, we would absolutely love to hear them. And you know, we come up with the set of 15 metaphors that we think are going to be best able to do a conceptual task, and we run them through this process, and we figure out how they work, right? We turn them on in different situations for different people and actually observe the way that a given metaphor affects the way that people think about the thing that we're asking them to think about. So I think to answer that question, there is a spot in this process where that type of input is incredibly valuable, and we should think about how we can create that input when we get to the part of the project, which is yet to be funded, but I hope we get to do it, where we're generating those metaphors. So, yeah. So my answer to that question, I guess, is yes.
Well, and you know, the interesting thing, too, is that, of course, people use metaphors all the time. Regular folks use metaphors, and experts use metaphors when they talk about these issues. And we will go back, we'll pour through all of our interviews, and we will always take the metaphors that people are using, especially the ones that experts are using and advocates are using, and we will definitely get them into that set of metaphors to test and see what happens. And the interesting thing is you find metaphors sometimes that experts are in love with and think work beautifully, and then when you go through and test them, it turns out they actually don't work to move the policies, to move support for the policies in the right way at all. And so that is the value of rigorously testing these with multiple methods.
Right. Thank you very much for that answer. The next question is, what are the next steps in this project? And that's actually one for Bridget and I. So there are a number of next steps. We've concluded the first phase of the project, which is the research that Mike and Nat have conducted for us and frameworks have conducted for us. And we're in the process of reaching out to the members of the National Human Services Assembly to get feedback from folks about particular issues and applications of this work, and we're currently in conversations with a number of funders to define exactly what that next step will be. What it'll most likely be is translating the results, like Nat and Mike have been talking about, into a series of usable either toolkits, presentations, trainings, that will then go out and work with folks, whether it's communication staff, whether it's training sessions at conferences, to continue to push out the research throughout the human services sector. We're also working with our sister organization, the American Public Human Services Association, which is our public sector counterpart So we're exploring a number of different options through the networks that we have access to push out the results, but also to fund the development of more practical tools. But again, part of our outreach process is to solicit feedback from our members about what would be most helpful. So everybody who's registered for this webinar will be added to our framing listserv, and that's the list that we continue to send out announcements. So future webinars, future research projects. You can also contact Bridget and myself. I'm Jarl Crocker, the program manager for this project. You can contact us directly through our email that you'll get through the through signing up for the listserv. So if you stay tuned, there will be announcements about future events, future products, and other opportunities that you can give us your feedback about what would be most helpful in terms of our second steps. Next question, and I think you've addressed this a little bit. What is an example of a metaphor that made it all the way through your process? And Nat, maybe if you could tell the story of toxic stress, because I think that's a really interesting example and speaks to what you were just talking about expert metaphors not always being the ones that make it through the process.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of good examples. A lot of them come from the issue of early child development, which is our deepest issue area. So we've been doing work on early child development. You know, it was the first project that we took on 13, 14 years ago, and we continue to work with the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University every year on kind of translating a new piece of the science of early child development. But one of the first pieces that we took on, one of the first kind of developmental messages that we took on was around stress. So we were finding again and again that when, and the scientists were finding it again and again, that when they got up and started talking about you know, serious adversity, early childhood adversity, and the detrimental effects of that, they were met with that, you know, they're saying AAA, and they were met with a decidedly different, you know, ZZZ, which was people's hesitance to think about stress as a bad thing, right? So there's a powerful kind of current of Nietzsche in American culture, which is what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I think this is part of the resilience problem as well. And when people think about stress as A, kind of an unavoidable reality of life, and B, through all of these stories that they have about people who have triumphed over adversity and have been stronger for it, they become very resistant, unsupportive, and even resistant to calls to limit stress that children are exposed to. So our task was to figure out some way of dealing with that problem. And the way that we dealt with it was through a metaphor that's frequently just called toxic stress, but is actually part of a bigger metaphor which breaks out stress into a taxonomy, right? So by telling people that there's stress that's positive, there's stress that's bad, but that's made tolerable by having support and buffering influence of supportive relationships. And then there is stress that disrupts development in such a way that we can really call it toxic, has been a wildly effective way at getting past people's, not getting past it, but dealing with people's sense that some stress is good, right, by having a tolerable and a positive part of that metaphor, but that clearly pointing out to them, giving them the ability to see and think about the fact that there is some stress, there are some adverse experiences which are so significant that they can really have long-lasting, serious effects on the way that children develop, learn, their health, their inflammatory systems, and all of the things that the scientists want to talk about. So that is a metaphor that made it all the way through this process. It's important to say that the scientists that we worked with were incredibly resistant to the metaphor for about a year and a half. There was no way that they were talking about toxic stress. And it took a lot of work on our part to get them familiar and facile with the metaphor to the point where, you know, it kind of is the way that it is now, which is it's been included in legislation in multiple states. It has been included and adopted as a feature, as a kind of initiative or a policy from the American Pediatric Association, and is really a very dominant frame in the public discourse around early child development.
It's a really interesting one to think about, too, when, you know, Nat stressed at the beginning of the talk how culture was the thing that was getting in the way here. And toxic stress is a really interesting one to think about in terms of some cross-cultural work that we're doing, where we're actually looking at, we're doing a project in Brazil on early child development. And turns out that toxic stress in the form it's in now doesn't make it through Brazil at all, because they actually have the very opposite problem, where for them all stress for children is of course toxic. Stress doesn't even belong in the same sentence as children. So we kind of flip the metaphor on its head in Brazil, and we're trying to get people in Brazil to see, well, maybe there's a little bit of stress, like working hard in school or something like that, that's actually okay and that could be acceptable. So the importance of metaphor, but also of culture here.
All right, so next question. In any of your work, have you found that equal access to opportunity resonates at all positively with the public? So opportunity to access a good education, good transportation, safe neighborhoods, those types of issues?
Absolutely. So we would call that value, which is another, I would argue, another version of fairness, kind of the third version that we've talked about on this call. There are 6 more, I guess. That's what we would call opportunity for all. That is a value that we frequently test and, has proven effective on a number of issues. So yes, that is a value that's on our kind of frequently tested list, which we do find is a powerful way of orienting people towards ideas of fairness. It's not too far away from fairness between places, I don't think. And it very much relates to the metaphor, which I'm not going to spend time talking about, that we've developed called the prosperity grid, which basically speaks to the unevenness of opportunity across place.
All right, I think that's all the questions that folks have sent in. So again, thank you everyone for your time and attending, and thanks for your patience in dealing. I know some of you had issues with the audio. We will send out a copy of the webinar so you can listen to it or distribute it to other networks that you might be a part of. And again, we'll add, unless you tell us to opt out, everyone's email who participated in the webinar to our framing listserv, so we can continue to send out information to you about next steps in the project. So Michael and Matt, thank you again for all your hard work on this project, and we look forward to hearing about future research.
All right, frame on. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.